thanks to the panel for this conversation, or for the presentation. So I think we have about 25 minutes now for conversation. And maybe I'll start it off with a question or two, and then hopefully it can evolve into something that's a little bit more organic across the panel. And so, Timothy, since you ended, and your presentation is probably fresh in everyone's mind, I'm going to go ahead and start with a question for you that I think will hopefully implicate and enlist the rest of the panel here. So in your presentation, in your example of Philip Johnson, you described the architect's use, or you said plundering, of historical narratives. And you described these being, or that kind of action of plundering of historical narratives being coupled with his kind of signature of his own work that essentially seals the architect's place in history, or it kind of cements his place in future history in a way. So at least in this example that you've given us, these two actions, that of recuperating history and that of sealing one's place in history through the signature, are parallel or aligned, or they seem to be somehow associated actions. So I wonder, kind of a two-part question. First, I wonder if you think this is commonly the case of those architects who necessarily recuperate history to kind of forward an agenda, are those architects who then also make their signature, so they therefore kind of cement their place in history. And then I wonder if you can speculate on how that reflects on the work of the designers that we have here today, Mark and Eric, or even thinking about how Penelope colored Tigerman. All of these people being, at least according to their presentations today, architects who do or have used history in one way or another, but also all of them being individuals that have these kinds of characteristics of anonymity, as you described them in the case of maybe parametrics in Mark's office, or the formation of alliances in Penelope's example of Tigerman, who later founded the Chicago 7. And then maybe we can open that up to responses to Timothy's response from the other panelists.
Okay. In the case of Philip Johnson, yes, those are coupled uses of history and uses by history. I don't think that that's a kind of inextricable or inevitable coupling. In the case of Johnson, the historicist sensibility had in a way, an interesting kind of almost perverse relationship to his future contract with history. And you could think of it this way, that in Johnson's signature, which is his claiming of the work, I designed this, I did the project, and I did it this way, and the kind of opening up of how I did it, how I collected these things, because the how I did it includes so many statements of say, imitation, of a kind of historicist thinking, of derivation, and because that's so insistently the theoretical stance, he actually is saying, I did this building, but the building was in a way already done. And so it's a very canny kind of movement where he's distancing himself, in a sense, removing himself as a direct author, and yet at the same time inserting himself very pointedly as the author, as the I in the assertion of the signature. So history is in both dimensions there. It's the use of history, the invocation of the use of history that allows him to accomplish the removal, a distancing of the work from himself, but it also becomes his signature assertion, that particular device of historicism or of the imitative. And it becomes even more relentless, really, as the work goes through its separate phases. I don't think the coupling of history, use by history is the essential one, though. It's more the relationship between a position of authorial removal or distancing, how you calibrate a certain proximity or distance to your work, and then the implications of that for some future contract. So as you asked us in the second part of that, how would that potentially apply in the kind of in the scenarios that were very interestingly explicated here? I suppose I had the sense in both Mark and yours, Eric, the kind of sense of an architect describing both a really intimately familiar body of work and also really, though, describing almost a process of familiarization, how you overcome a certain kind of estrangement in your own work. And I'll explain how I got that sense. first of all, there's not clearly a sort of explicit authorial removal, right? I mean, after all, you both literally have your name on the door, right? So it's not that kind, but there are other actions of removal, I think, that are there. My sense was, as you're describing the situation in China, both in the two narratives, both in the subliminal narrative and then also in the courtyard house narrative, that there was an attempt to somehow make the project familiar. You know, how do you familiarize it? How do you make it something that you, in fact, have the sense of authorship over and a way of control over, so that the process of trying to take these explicit, but to you, actually foreign historicist demands, you know, it must be the courtyard house, it must have a pitched roof, and to translate those into something that would make them familiar, so that in a way you can adopt the project as your own, is what I'm describing, as a way that the work is, in a sense, initially estranged, and that there's a process of making it familiar, because the project seems to have, in the way you described it, a kind of presence outside itself. And then in the way that you described your work, Mark, it was different, but also you had a way of describing it almost as a way of taming the work, of kind of domesticating it within something slightly beyond your control into a position of control, a position of regulation, and using a kind of the recursive feedback loop to history to enable that, and kind of produce that sense of domestication. There certainly isn't a description from either of you of this kind of volitional act of, hell with it, I just did it. You know, this is how it is. It was very much described as a kind of slowly bringing the project into a kind of a compass of control, and that's what I'm describing as a process of kind of familiarization. So it wasn't a process of authoring, maybe in the sense of, I did this, but a sense of becoming the author of a certain kind of process, a certain kind of project. That was the just sensibility, but of course I was thinking about my own presentation while you guys were talking, so I prejudiced that way already.
So I wonder if you two would like to, if you'd be interested, or maybe going back to the previous, even to my question in some ways to Timothy. I guess, Mark, you would be maybe the ideal person in some ways to answer this. I wonder if in using history the way you do, within kind of recuperating historical narratives, if you understand yourself as being situated then in a kind of future history, in what, not using, these aren't my terms, but using Eric's term, Eric used the term the master narrative. I wonder if there is some of that kind of motivation to it, or if this is simply a kind of tool or a way to build technique or to understand past technique and reuse past technique in architecture.
Yeah, I'll answer that. Okay, two-part answer. I'll try to remember the second part after I finish with the first part. It always happens that I finish the first part and forget the rest.
You can just cut it off.
In Complexity and Contradiction, my favorite part is when Venturi writes about Rudolph talking about Mies. And Venturi says that Rudolph says that architecture is more than just the solution to problems, that you choose the amount of, I'm paraphrasing, that you choose the problems that you choose to tackle. And Rudolph says regarding Mies, he says, Mies chose not to tackle a lot of problems, so his buildings are in a sense problematic. That's what makes them potent. And I think that lack of, that Mies was trying to do something which was more than something that was inscribed in the problem he was presented with. And I think what Mies was interested in, and Rudolph, and Venturi, is exhibiting a type of virtuosity. And I don't personally think that necessarily everyone engaged with the practice of architecture is necessarily engaged with the history of architecture. So I think the application of an ambition to be virtuous is something that only very few architects have, and I don't know if I would include Eric in that, but you know, I'd be lying if I said I didn't want, you know, my grandchildren to know that I had done something significant to the profession. So I won't be signing anything anonymous anytime soon. What was the second part? See? What was the other thing you mentioned? The second part of your.
Well, I'm not sure I remember now. But, I mean, I guess I was also getting at, I wonder if this is, well, I think you've answered the question. If you are interested in writing yourself into the history of architecture as
Oh,
virtuous.
the other thing I wanted to say, I just remembered, it's funny to you, is that I don't understand how you can be contemporary or seek to be innovative without knowing history. Like without knowing that you're reproducing something which has been reproduced multiple times before. I have students all the time that think they're producing something wonderful until you say, oh, that's just like Isozaki did 18 years ago, And it's just that there's a relationship. Architectural history, I guess historically, has remembered the things which were innovative for a variety of reasons. And that could be innovative in terms of Philip Johnson, who wasn't, in my opinion, a great designer, but was one of the greatest architectural wits ever to walk the face of the earth. And he's remembered for that, and that comes through in his buildings. I think that architects are remembered, and architecture is remembered for somehow providing something which overcomes how problematic it is and how it doesn't address all of the problems of everyday use. Whether that's charisma or design virtuosity, I think is less important, but I think there's something there that deserves having its name on the door.
Okay, well, maybe if we can, I'm going to still try to pull Eric in here. I mean, another thing I thought was interesting between the two designers, at least, Mark was advocating really for history. It should be said it's history as precedent. In this case, we're talking about history as precedent here.
Not stylistically, though.
Not stylistically, but nonetheless, precedent has been used this way before. I thought it was interesting that you, Mark, were really the kind of advocate, in a way, for the use of history in contemporary practice in some ways. And you, Eric, were a bit more reticent. But it was interesting to me that when it came up, even though you kind of cast it cast the use of history as like yet another tool that we might use today, when it did come up, it had kind of attachments. It was not the recuperation of technique, but it was the recuperation of something with some sort of cultural resonance. In this case, maybe just direct cultural signification. So I wonder if I could get you to reflect on that a little bit more, and maybe to reflect on the difference then in the use of history between what you will use reluctantly, or when you will think historically reluctantly, and when Mark will kind of constantly recuperate history to make technique in a very direct way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I received the email saying I was going to be on this panel, I asked, well, why me? Because it didn't seem like
April Fools.
Yeah. It didn't seem like an obvious thing. And actually, I appreciate the kind of provocation, because I sort of went back and I thought about it, and I tried to sort of position some of the work that we've done. I would say the 3 projects I showed are completely different, and each of them has different resonances, and each one uses different precedents differently. In China, we for the Chengdu project, we had to, it was sort of forced upon us, and we reluctantly took it on. And then we, as Timothy said, we sort of found ways to make it, Timothy said to own it, and I think, it's something that we would be confident to put our signature to it. If it had been purely a sort of historic sort of quotation, we would have not been interested in it. So we found ways to make it sort of contemporary. And in doing that, I guess I realized that when we talk about history, we're talking about, what are we talking about? Is it Alberti, and how does that figure? Or is it Archigram, or is it, our contemporaries? And so what I was arguing was that the notion of history has expanded right up until the present moment, right up until now. And so we are surrounding ourselves with a series of techniques, and we were sort of immersed in this sort of, I call it a kind of ether or vapor, that it's unavoidable. And so how do we sort of recognize that, and how do we use that, I think, productively in different contexts? I think it's undeniable, so how do we sort of turn that into, I guess a design methodology? So it's not just denial, but it's actually acknowledgement and potentially useful. And the other point I wanted to make was that, it's so different. When we talk about history here, we're talking about history in China. They have such a completely different understanding of what we're talking about. And I said the thing about the 4,000 years versus the 10 years. They say Shanghai is 200 years old, but Chengdu is 4,000 years old. And how are you going to sort of deny someone who wants to sort of work in that long span or that long range view? So I guess the point was it's more situational. If it's appropriate, if it's useful, if it's applicable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it struck me also that in some ways, then I felt like you had something in common with Penelope, and that for both of you, it was a kind of tactic. I mean, Penelope, in your case, it seemed like you were advocating and talking about the way Tigerman and his group used history in a very specific rhetorical way just to clear a kind of intellectual space. So the fact, I wonder, I mean, I guess I'll turn this into a question. I wonder if the fact that it was history, that they were making a historical narrative, did that hold any privilege in what they did, or could it have been, was it just kind of agitprop? It could have been through another avenue, through a different tactic to kind of clear the space for their project.
I think in the context of Chicago, they could only have done it by basically fabricating history, because the power structure in professional practice was basically held by the second generation of architects who'd been educated under Meese. And so the Tigerman's problem wasn't at all with Meese, in fact, but it was with the generation below Meese that he thought were incredibly mediocre, not allowing young officers to get work. And so this was the only chance for them to somehow clear that space, but they also had to do it in an extremely public way. It wouldn't have worked if it played out in the academy. It had to play out in the public media as a public relations stunt, so that people could actually see that there were alternatives available. And maybe I just want to ask Eric something, because I was really struck by the beginning of your talk when you described that we're in a situation of multiple audiences, multiple problems, diffuse histories. I can't remember all of these terms that you used. It sounded fantastic, and I wish I believed you. In other words, I think that it's where we want to be, but I don't think we're there yet. And the reason is because I think that the discourses are still really polarized, maybe within the academic situation, into green or the digital, or maybe there are a couple of other areas of interest, but I'm not so sure it's as diffuse as you make it sound. And indeed, I think we want to have more positions and more disagreement, and I'm all for signature.
Yeah, I was struck when you said we're in a polarized moment, and I didn't feel that way. And
hence the split between profession and the academy.
yeah, I mean, I guess those have been always been.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. I mean, I guess the split between the profession and the academy has always been sort of split, but I'm just struck by the fact that today anything goes. I mean, you can have FAT next to FOA, and in a way they're equalized, and they're actually sort of using similar techniques, which is interesting as well. So I think there is a kind of anything goes kind of situation.
Is that good?
Well, I think it makes the choices that we make more necessary, more deliberate. I mean, I heard your presentation describe the need for this kind of public combat in a way, and through that exhibition, which I thought was a kind of interesting moment historically. And I was thinking, how would we do that today? Because I'm interested in how do we, what's useful for us now? And I thought, well, could we stage such a thing, today? And what would be the camps, green versus brown, digital versus analog. I mean, I think if that were possible to mobilize a kind of singular audience or singular lens of the media, I don't think it is. I mean, there's so many channels. You couldn't harness that kind of attention through one show, or you'd have to be incredibly good to do it. I was thinking about Mark when Marcelo had the Matters of Sensation show, which we're both in. And this was a moment I felt that Marcelo Spina had organized a show, Matters of Sensation, at the Artist Space in New York. Peter Zellner, who's here, was also sort of implicated in that. But there was a moment to try to assess the digital, after the sort of crash, after the wave of digital has sort of crashed over us, and going through issues of fabrication and material. And I thought there was a great kind of self-consciousness there to try to sort of take the temperature of the age and sort of understand that moment. And I think that show was sort of coupled with a book. It was coupled with a series of discussions. And you were interested in sort of putting together a group of people that would actually have this kind of record that discussion. I remember I wasn't able to make it, but there was a moment where you said, let's write this down because it might be interesting, to sort of benchmark this moment in time. So I think there is a kind of self-consciousness to the way we're working today. I do think it requires sort of deliberate energy to sort of draw lines, sort of frame positions. But I think without that sort of energy to sort of put that together, it would all be kind of muddy and kind of sprawling. So the role of historian, the role of curator, the role of kind of self-consciousness, I think is necessary to differentiate amongst all that sort of muddiness.
But do you think history really is going to be the vehicle for that that self-consciousness, kind of curating that self-consciousness? I'm struck in the Chicago example of the salience of history at that moment, right? 1976 is not just the Chicago and Chicago architects with the bicentennial. I mean, I remember just being awash in history as a kid in the bicentennial year. I mean, everything, just every display of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, this, that. History was just the common currency for that entire year. And I wonder, so now, this year, what would be the common currency? And I think Mark is right to argue that if we need some compensatory mechanism for flattening, for this kind of contemporary moment of flattening of the kind of amateur research, that history offers itself seemingly because of its depth, because it is actually something that works against synchrony in that sense. But does it have, in addition to that, does it also have the kind of cultural purchase that it had in 1976? Is this something, or are there other models of basically depth that you would point to achieve that same kind of, say, relevance or distinctiveness or perception of the self-consciousness of that drawing a ring about everything? Is history really the mode, the way it would have been in Chicago in 1976?
I think, if I can answer that, my opinion on that is that history is maybe the only common ground we have left.
Is it discipline or more generally?
No, as a discipline. Yeah. I love the fact that I'm sitting in this room, and I had a conversation with John McMurrow beforehand, that this room has a very high degree of resonance with a room by Joseph Urban at the New School in Manhattan. Joseph Urban was a Viennese set designer and architect who also designed the base for what Sir Norman Foster just added the Hearst Tower to. And he had a position of theatricality in architecture. So knowing that about Joseph Urban and knowing that his space looks like this tells me something about the space that we're in. And I like that I can make those connections across time. I also like knowing that Stanley Tigerman, who was on my jury last semester for an advanced studio I taught, worked for Paul Rudolph. Paul Rudolph was the only person ever to have his face on the cover of every architectural magazine at the time, and was basically a press monster. So those skills that Tigerman developed emerged from his exposure to other architects, that history permeates everything we do. And I'll wrap up what I'm going to say here. I just finished a book on aesthetic theory, so I have it on the mind. And there's a theorist, Elaine Scarry at Harvard, who makes a case for looking at a vase. And if you see a vase as being something beautiful, then that may make you change your attitude towards other vases or see things which you hadn't seen in other vases previously. And I think history is the only thing which we can count on, a history of architecture, history in architecture that all architects have been educated in and will be educated in, and that can be a common ground that we're allowed to have common discussions. Because otherwise, we're just going to have people from the green camp and the parametric camp talking about what they're doing with no reference point. It's as if you're a musician, you can be a violinist, and you can be a saxophone player, and you can be on other sides of a table, and you can still communicate about Gershwin. we need that common ground. We need to have that knowledge of history. And I cannot imagine, and it's happening more and more, even the schools where I've been involved in, that history is being taught less and less. It's becoming basically a timeline and a checklist. And I think that's part of the reason we don't have any consensus in any discourse nowadays, is because it's become so light.
I'm not so sure it's that history is all we need. I think that we need to be able to define disciplinary projects, and the problem with the green and certain factions of the digital is that there's no disciplinary project in the work, and that it has become a kind of specialist discourse that's either moved into engineering or moved into science and so on.
So you can either disciplinarily surround
like
it.
if we can't discuss ideas and situate them, I mean, I would argue that would be, for me, the common ground, that we're all somehow producers or interested in ideas, of which history may be part, but it's not the determining
Yeah, I agree with that.
factor.
I just think as a pedagogical point in an institution like this, that you can't teach, let's say you can't
Sure.
teach anything but, you can, of the things we've discussed, the thing that you can teach is history. And one way to define a new disciplinary agenda, such as parametricism or sustainability, is to do so by figuring out the salient issues in that discipline and codifying them. The other way is to take what that discipline is relative to what preceded it.
Okay, well, much as I hate to cut conversation off when it seems lively, thanks to our panelists.